Today, over the next 30 minutes or so, we want to dig into these topics here, right? So why do policies matter to startups or to any organization, but in this case, startups in particular? The policies that you have probably experienced in your working life and through your career are what I would call conventional policies. It's kind of the old school way of writing policies, and they're not that effective. There's many pitfalls with how policies are traditionally written, and there's really a better way to do it, and that's what I want to share with you today. So we'll talk about what some of the issues are with conventional policies, and I don't blame people for writing policies in a conventional manner. It's kind of what we're all used to. But there is a better way, and that is what I'll talk about in point 3, which is how can we, us together, write more effective policies that are very clear and that they're valid, that they stand up when tested. And that's a really important concept in policy writing is, will they hold up if scrutinized by an external body, like a regulator, like a court of law? And lastly, we'll cover off some of the topic areas and the specific policies that I think startups should give some consideration to getting rolling on. And I get it, you're busy trying to grow your business and raise funding and hire staff and kind of move things forward, and policies is way down on the priority pile. But hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll see that it may be a good idea to bubble it up towards the top of the pile and sort of chip away at it, so that when the time comes where it's really required, you've got the policies you need to achieve your goals. So that's what we'll cover. Well-written policies support a lot of things. They support, obviously, regulatory compliance. That they are a key tool for regulators and for you as an organizational principal to demonstrate to regulators that you've got your compliance under control. You know what laws apply to you and you're complying with them. So that's key. Policies, if they're written well, also support the standards that you want to accomplish or work to in your organizations. And so there may be third-party standards that you take on board because you have to, for the nature of the work you're doing or the business you're in, or because you want to just have a differentiator that makes you better than your competitors because you've taken on board, say, an ISO standard around information security, or a safety standard like CORE, or any of the other standards that apply to your industry. Say you're doing manufacturing, good manufacturing practices. So your policies support you in achieving your standards goals. Likewise, you may have funder requirements or other third-party requirements, client requirements placed upon you, and it's your policies where you make the commitments around achieving those requirements and where you actually demonstrate that you do. So those are some of the external drivers of your policies. There's also internal drivers. Obviously, you write policies to make your operations effective and repeatable and efficient, and so policies drive that. Policies, as you might expect and probably intuitively think of immediately, are a tool that you use to engage your people, right? To get them on board and on side and everyone on the same page, understanding what are priorities and where we're all going together, and obviously supporting their performance towards strategic goals. And lastly, and that's why I call my company Policy Protect, policies are a critical tool for risk control and mitigating and controlling all the risks that you float in, including regulatory risk and compliance risk and operational risk and reputational risk. There's a ton of risks out there. Policies can help with that if they're written well. If they're not written well, then these things don't get accomplished. So that's why it's important to have policies. Just kind of thinking about the regulatory side of the world, because it is one of the most important aspects of being an owner and a business and a startup. And as soon as you start having employees, you've got to comply with employment standards and occupational health and safety and Human Rights Act here in Alberta and across Canada. As soon as you have one employee hired, all this stuff comes to bear on your organization and you as directors and officers. Other areas of regulatory compliance, depending on the kinds of work you do and the information you hold, obviously Personal Information and Privacy Act and the Privacy Commissioner here in Alberta has rules around how you deal with information around specific individuals and how you store it, use it, give access to it, protect it, and if there's a breach, how and when you report it, that sort of thing. So if you're storing personal information about your clients or study participants, if you're doing health work, That's all covered by law, and so you got to comply, and others. And lastly, some of the other ones like federal laws, like Canada's anti-spam law absolutely applies to startups when they're doing their marketing, and the Competition Act absolutely applies to startups when they're getting out there in the marketplace and advertising and hiring people and so on. And your industry and sector will have other laws, regulations, and codes that apply to you. So those are some of the compliance areas. And you know what? All these laws have teeth. Most of the times these laws are enforced through complaints. So anyone can complain about your organization, do a web form to OH&S or Human Rights or whoever, and they'll investigate. They come on site and they'll investigate. And the penalties that are applied are obviously can be applied to your organization, but they can also pierce the corporate veil. You personally, as the director or officer, can be held liable and responsible. But the penalties, holy smokes, it's wild what penalties can apply to organizations such as yours. So, all good? I just heard someone talking. Probably time for me to take a breath anyways. So, for example, in Alberta, the inspection arms of the various branches of the government can come onto any premises without a warrant and investigate. And so if you turn away an inspector, you're probably going to get fined. And this was the actual situation where an inspector came to a site and wanted to inspect, and they said, no, come back tomorrow. So they fixed everything, and the inspector came back, and they were fined $92,000 for delaying an inspector's access to their premises by 1 day. That's a lot of money. This one applies to you. If you're a small business or a startup and you're sending out emails, obviously you're going to be using a web-based email application that has unsubscribe, because if you don't, like this Quebec company was found to be in violation of Canada's anti-spam law, and they sent out 317 emails and were fined $1.2 million for sending out and being in breach of Canada's anti-spam law. So that's a chunk of change. They reduced it to 200 on appeal, but nevertheless they went out of business. And this is really important. This is for all of you. This is new. No poaching arrangements are situations where you have a mutual agreement between some other employer and you agree not to hire each other's employees, right? To recruit them, or if they apply, to screen them out immediately. So that notion of no poaching is considered by Canada's Competition Act to be anti-competitive in the labor market. And last March, they amended the Competition Act, and it comes into force this March. They're giving us a year to get our ducks in a row. But it's considered criminal conspiracy. And so if you, as a director or an officer of a startup, engage in this, you can go to prison. You can go to prison for 14 years. And they used to have a $2 million maximum fine. Now it's unlimited, or both. So this is as serious as a heart attack. So, this whole notion of regulatory compliance is so important because the penalties do get applied to startups and small organizations. So it's important. Now we'll switch gears a little bit. Hopefully I've got your attention in terms of why policies are important and starting with compliance and for other reasons. So the pitfalls of the kinds of policies that you're used to seeing are many, and they get in the way of achieving the goals that we talked about earlier in terms of compliance and employee engagement and operational effectiveness. And so some of the pitfalls, and this is what you're typically used to, right? This kind of a thing, right? Metadata at the top of the page and thick black lines and numbered paragraphs and multiple indented paragraphs that just kind of go on and on. Not a very engaging tool, not very easy to use by your people. Really, really hard to maintain too. Here's more examples, kind of goes on and on. These are what you're probably used to when you think of policies. And so the pitfalls that you see in these and other policies are many. And the first one is a very disengaging, disheartening tone and words, and very, very authoritarian and legalistic. And so, often you'll see, I don't know what it is. When we write policies, holy smokes, we turn into little tyrants, right? We think we have to wave our fists and shake a stick and threaten people with termination on every other page to get them to comply with, the rules we've put down on paper. And that's not really the case. And so you'll see things like must and you must always, and there are no exceptions, and it's strictly forbidden. And we have zero tolerance for this, that, and the other thing. that really does disengage the kind of people that you want in your organization. Right? If you're trying to be an employer of choice and trying to grow with great people, don't talk to them like children. Don't yell at them. Don't threaten them with their jobs on every other page. So those are some of the pitfalls that you see in policies that you're used to. And again, often we try and puff up and make, with more gravitas, seem more important our policies, right? Again, to try and get compliance and get people to feel like they've been told. And so you see shall and hereby and all kinds of legalese. And policies are rules for sure, but they're not laws. And we're not lawyers, and we shouldn't write them as lawyers in law. So and I'll talk about sort of getting rid of all that. But those are some of the the pitfalls that you'll see in many policies, and it really does disengage and dishearten and not be the kind of employer you want to be. Another one, and I talked about it briefly and you saw examples, is a bit of an affected formatting. Again, trying to use formatting to impart importance on the policy. So, bold and caps and underlining and boxed content and thick black lines and long paragraphs of prose. And TLDR is too long, didn't read, as I'm sure most of you know. Metadata, sort of all these things that are, stylistic elements intended to create gravitas and really just get in the way of comprehension. They really slow people down. They get in the way of people trying to understand and find what they need. And more and more as we move our policies to web-based tools like policy management systems or DMS or CCMSs, all this formatting is taken care of anyways by your application. So you can get rid of it rather rapidly anyway. But the last two, the most critical pitfalls that you'll see and I see in policies are two things. The first thing is a little dead cat there now, is the lack of differentiation in the content. Many policies that I see, you see, that you're used to, is just brain dump, this sort of is throwing the kitchen sink at it in hopes that something is going to stick in terms of rules and procedures and suggestions and guidelines and all kinds of content sort of stuffed together and called a policy, or sometimes called a policy and then called a procedure, and all just the same kind of content. So that gets in the way because it's really hard to find things as a employee, as a regulator. It's hard to find, it's hard to maintain, it's hard to update. So that lack of differentiation is a problem, critical issue. And the most important thing, kind of working up to the most important thing, is that often you'll see policies are written from the boss's voice to the employee. The sole focus is on directing the employee's performance or prohibiting things that they're not supposed to do. And it's missing that whole other side of content that the regulators want to see. Because when a regulator comes and looks at your policy, they don't care what you ask your employees to do. They care what you say you're going to do as an organization in the voice of the organization. So that's a real problem with most traditional or conventional policies, is they lack the specific content that external audiences need to verify that you're compliant. So those are the big pitfalls that I see all the time. And how do we solve that? Well, that's kind of the next thing. But I hope that makes sense. It's not really a setup, good format for answering questions on the fly, but I will have time at the end to sort of ask me anything, and we can go back and forth and kind of cover off anything that you want to cover off in a little more detail. So those are some of the pitfalls of the policies that are out there. And if you're doing a startup and you haven't got any policies in place, great. You automatically don't need to worry about it because you're starting from a clean page. And I encourage you not to download policies off the internet and copy them, because they're going to be written in a conventional format. Well, here's a little secret. You'd think it would break my heart to see this, but I know you know this already. People don't read policies, right? No, they don't. They refer to them, okay? So policies are a reference tool. Nobody sits down with a cup of tea and their fuzzy slippers and reads policies for fun. Maybe your new employees do as you get them oriented to the organization, but on a day-to-day basis, they're there idling in the background and they're consumed when needed by people who are in a hurry and busy. So they're a reference tool. And I think it's really important to write them as such, and to not write them like a novel where you have to kind of read from front to back and try and memorize it all, but write them in a way that allows people to, I need to know this, there it is, next, and I'm back to work. We do that. Well, we start by differentiating the documents and knowing exactly what a policy is versus a procedure versus other guidance documents that you might have in place in your startup. So let me be real clear. A policy is a rule. And so your policies are your rule book, right? And in them, you include the rules you set out for your employees, obviously, but you also include the rules you set out for yourself as an organization. Those are the two main elements of any policy, are the commitments and the expectations. Your commitments as an organization and the expectations of your people. That's a policy. It's a rule. And so a procedure is a different thing. And if you're in the life sciences or you took science in grade 9, you understand a procedure is very much like, what are the resources I need? All right, what are the steps to do this in a repeated and consistent fashion? And what result do I expect? And so your procedures look and feel a lot different than your policies because they're a different animal. They are very much a tool for people to follow to do something consistently. Okay. And then guidance documents are all the other documents you need that aren't policies or procedures. And so there's lots of them, and I'll just kind of expand on this a tiny bit more. There's really two kinds of procedures: operational and emergency response. And so again, as soon as you've got people, you're responsible for their health and safety in the event of an emergency. As soon as you've got one employee, the OH&S Act Regulation Code falls upon your head. So even if they're working from home, even you're responsible for people, your employees, who are working remotely, wherever they're working. Their home office is a little embassy of your company. And if they fall and are injured in their home office, you're responsible. So you need emergency response procedures. And likewise, guidance documents, there's all kinds of them, but your employee handbooks is a pretty obvious one. Your health and safety manuals, once you get larger, and if you're in safety sensitive workplaces, they can be pretty extensive. If you're doing any kind of health information, especially, the Health Information Act requires privacy impact assessments. So those are those reference documents. They're a little they're less list-based, but again, there's ways to write them that make them easy to use. So start by differentiating, knowing what goes where. And like I said earlier, people don't read them like a book, so don't write them like a book. Use a list-based format, and hopefully you can see this. I'll send you a link to, or I'll give you a link to this actual policy in Word, and so you've got it as a template. But you can see there's really only 6 elements, right? And look how clean and easy it is to wrap your eyes around, even just your eyes. I prefer, if on the written page like this, I prefer 2 columns because it shortens the line length, and that's just, people have trouble getting their eye across 7.5 inches of text. So a half page or a half column line length is easier to use. So you've got really 6 elements. You've got the title, you've got the policy statement, the application, who does it apply to, and what situations, what locations, and then those 2 critical elements I talked about, the commitments of the organization and the expectations of your people, and then some metadata. And I put that at the end, not at the start, because it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the title and the policy statement. The metadata is, in fact, if you're using a web-based tool, the metadata is taken care of by your application. You don't even have to include it in the body of the policy. And the nice thing about putting the metadata at the end is it lets you know your policy's over. Okay, read that, read this. Oh, looks like the policy's done because I've got to the metadata. So that list-based format is super easy to reference as a user, whether you're an employee or a regulator or a supervisor. It's super easy to write in the first place because you're really just going, okay, what belongs in this list? What are the commitments that we say we're going to step up to regarding this topic? And what do we ask our employees to do or not do regarding this topic? And easy to update, easy to maintain, easy to approve, just easy to use. So I really encourage you to give some consideration to, when you're writing your policies, to use a list-based format. And I'm very much an incremental kind of a guy. I'm like, lather, rinse, repeat. If you have, say you want to write 6 policies, write 2 today and bang out those lists, and then write 2 tomorrow and write 2 by Friday, and you're done. I mean, it can really help with breaking down the level of effort to get your policy manual in place. And I'll just, the policy statement is a really important element. And so you'll see lots of organizations and policy documents that kind of wax eloquent on the statement. They go on and on. When really the policy statement is simply the decision. It's the kernel decision of that topic. It's like, okay, what's your policy on this topic? It means like, what's your decision on this topic? So for example, this is the accommodation policy. Your company accommodates the needs of individuals in its workplaces to the point of undue hardship on the company. That's our decision. That's our policy. What's your policy on accommodation? That's our policy. And it's very easy to understand. And you notice it's not, we strive to, we endeavor to, on a good day, if the sun's shining, we will, try to accomplish, it's a very, this is what we do. It's plain and simple. Okay. And that helps everybody. That helps your employees, your supervisors, and your regulators. And by the way, this one's just mandatory. This is required under the Alberta Human Rights Act. So, you're simply repeating a requirement or a decision that's already placed upon you. We resolve issues that arise in our workplaces in a timely, respectful, and decisive manner. What's your policy on issues when they come up in the workplace? Well, that's it right there. What's your policy on violence? Well, we prohibit it. What's your policy on health information? We protect health information in our custody and control using an integrated system of administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. And then the rest of the policy follows, right? But the policy statement is where you really make clear what your decision is. So moving on to sort of like part 4 is the policies that I recommend that you consider having as a startup. And so there's basically 6 areas of policy. As you can see on the screen, governance and operations is the first thing. Employment, as soon as you have employees. Health and safety, as soon as you have employees. Anytime you've got any kind of information that you need to protect. And hopefully, startups, you're going to know the difference between information management, which is one thing, information technology, which is another thing, and information security, which is a third thing. Those are all 3 broad topic areas under the title of information. So there's policies required and procedures required under all 3 areas. Privacy protection is sort of aligned with 4, but is on its own because it's got its own law. And financial accounting, and finance and accounting. So there's things you need to do to comply with the laws and also generally accepted accounting principles. So here, and you know what, I'm going to link you to my catalog as well. In the catalog, there's all kinds of policies under all these topic areas. And so the ones I pulled out of that catalog and are showing you today are simply a best guess, right? Obviously, you need to figure out what your compliance drivers are and what your goals are for compliance and for operations, and pick the policies you need. But here's some that I think you should think about. Obviously, if you're incorporated as a society or a for-profit corporation or nonprofit corporation, you need to have bylaws. Your lawyers are going to give you this. Normally, your lawyers provide your bylaws, but sometimes you got to write them yourself. And then it's all about just protecting your stuff, right? The next 3 bullets are, how do we protect our reputation, right? So who communicates for us on behalf of, and on what topics, and do we allow our people to, sort of broadcast communications to the world, or under what circumstances do we ask them to do that? That's one thing. Intellectual property and your physical assets are both 2 things that you're developing and that you own, and you're going to protect with patents, and you're going to protect it with trade secrets, especially if you're a startup, and making clear that employees have a responsibility for protecting those things. And you know what, your employment agreements and your job offers are going to reflect this as well. And it's important that your job offers and employment agreements are consistent with your policies around the protection of your stuff. Administration, again, once you've got some employees, the employment standards code talks about the rules around attendance and time off, and how you pay people and how much vacation they get. But that's the baseline. And so you'll probably have made decisions around how you're going to pay people that's over and above the baseline that's put out there under the employment standards code. Just general conflicts of interest and ethical standards about operating in your organization. The third one, duty to accommodate. I've already shown you an example. That's mandatory. If an employee puts up their hand and says, owner, director, boss, I have this issue that especially if it's under the protected grounds under human rights, I need accommodation, you have a responsibility to investigate, and if you can, accommodate. And if you don't, you're going to get a human rights complaint and you'll get investigated and you might lose. So have that policy. And then lastly, again, a short list, but that progressive discipline or performance improvement policy. What happens if somebody's performance is off track, right? How do you get them back on track? And if you can't get them back on track, how do you get them out of the organization? Health and safety, these are, as soon as you have one employee, you have to describe the various roles and responsibilities in your organization for health and safety. You have to describe how you respond to emergencies. You have the first fundamental right of all workers in Alberta and other provinces is the right to be told what safety hazards exist in their workplaces and how your organization controls them. So health and hazards and controls policy. In 2018, harassment was made part of occupational health and safety. It's a known workplace hazard. And so you're all required to have a policy, procedure, and plan to prevent and address, when it happens, workplace harassment and discrimination and workplace violence. It's in the code, part 27. So here's the three that I think probably are the most important is that acceptable use of information technology, that it's mostly about telling your people what they can and can't do with your information technology, right? And that will cover off a whole myriad of things, including the anti-hate speech and introducing viruses and breaking copyright law and downloading software without license and stuff like that. Information classification is really important to get that right out of the gate, right? And so that's what information is public, what information is internal. It doesn't matter if it gets out there, like our job descriptions or our policies, but it's really designed internally. What information is confidential, what information is restricted, right? Restricted is like pay structures and contracts and things like that. And then lastly, I think if you've got any kind of personal or health information, what's your information incident or breach policy, and you'll have an associated procedure because you've got reporting requirements if you lose somebody's information. 5, privacy protection. Again, these are all driven out of the couple of acts, Health Information Act and the Privacy Act. And 6, internal financial controls is really important. It's funny, not funny. I know of a lawyer, a law firm, smaller firm. They had a trusted employee doing the books for them, and that trusted employee defalcated with $2 million. And the Law Society of Alberta made the lawyer pay it back, and so this lawyer paid it out of his pocket. It took him a couple of months to scrape together $2 million. I don't know how long it would take you, but it would take me a long time. And so having internal financial controls laid down and segregation of duty and all that kind of stuff is really important out of the gate. And lastly, your purchasing. That you're required under a few laws to purchase with ethics, right? That you don't jerk around your vendors, you don't get prices from vendors and without really being serious, stuff like that. And also, at what level do we do sole sourcing? At what level do we do, open tender, stuff like that? So that is what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the importance of policies. I want to talk about some of the issues you face with the policies you've probably seen in the past and might have already put in place. I wanted to give you a method to write policies that's easier to do than writing long paragraphs and easier to use going forward. And I wanted to give you just a sense of what kind of policies you might want to put in place. And so if you go to my website, policyprotect.com, this is not in the menu. You've got to know that it's just /ERIN, and I've got a few downloads there. I've got this PowerPoint presentation with the graphics stripped out. I've got the catalog, so it gives you some ideas around policies and other documents. And then I've downloaded as Word or uploaded as Word that accommodation policy. So you can take that as a starting point. You can use it as a template, go nuts.